Welcome to Crash Course, a podcast about business, political, and social disruption, and what we can learn from it. I'm Tim O'Brien. Today's Crash Course, Nukes, Russia, and our new Cold War. The world has never been a settled place, but it has been enveloped by sweeping existential challenges in recent years. The COVID-19 lockdowns offered a public health crisis reminiscent of epidemics that once seemed passé. And that Russian-U.S. Cold War from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that also seemed consigned to the history books? Well, that's back with us too. In other words, everything old is new again, including frosty global military conflicts and the looming threat of nuclear confrontations. There's even a hit movie out about the dawn of the nuclear era, Oppenheimer. Ever since Vladimir Putin sent Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine in early 2022, assumptions about the possibility of war in the 21st century have been turned on their heads. A long absence of conflict in Europe gave way to a bloody and sustained ground war. Russia has even warned it might unleash nuclear missiles. China, rattling its own saber in Asia, looms large in the background, just as it did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The primary lesson of the Ukraine war, Hal Brands has written, is that nuclear coercion will be essential to prevailing in the rivalries that define our age. The nukes are now the new normal. Hal is a foreign policy professor at Johns Hopkins University, co-author of Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China, a member of the State Department's Foreign Affairs Policy Board, and a Bloomberg Opinion columnist. And he joins Crash Course today. Welcome, Hal.
Thanks for having me.
Great to spend time with you. You know, my big overarching question of somebody like you who studies and watches these things is, would you have thought 10 years ago, or say even a year and a half ago, that this is where Europe and the U.S. would be right now with Russia?
No, probably not. 10 years ago, we were still before the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea, although we had seen the Russian attack on Georgia in 2008. But I think there was still a significantly greater degree of hope then in Washington, but especially in a number of European capitals, that Russia might still make its peace with the international system that the United States and its European allies had done so much to construct and maintain over the years. That obviously turned out not to be the case, but even, I guess, a little bit more than a year and a half ago, if you go back to the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was a significant amount of disbelief in Washington, but also even more so in European capitals, that Russia was actually going to do this, that it was actually going to try to wipe a sovereign state off the map, annex much, if not all, of its territory, and extinguish its existence as an independent political entity. That just didn't seem like something that happened in the modern world. It seemed like something that was ripped from the 1930s. And so I think it actually took the shock of the invasion to convince a lot of skeptics that we had entered either a fundamentally new world or we were threatened with a return to an older, darker world. And that has really produced a lot of the intensified transatlantic cooperation we've seen over the past year and a half. And some of what we've seen is actually quite remarkable. And so you've seen Germany, which spent more than a generation cultivating its addiction to Russian energy, kick that habit fairly quickly. You've seen Poland take steps to turn itself into a major military power. You've seen Ukraine pulled closer to NATO and the European Union and the West writ large than anyone would have anticipated. And you've seen the North Atlantic Treaty Organization be revitalized and expanded to bring in Finland and Sweden in a way that many people certainly would not have predicted 2 years ago.
And why was that? This is one of the curious things to me, given all of the informational and observational firepower that exists in the digital era and the amount of communication and analysis that's available to both policymakers and diplomats, certainly, and to others as well, military strategists. Was it simply that no one thought that Vladimir Putin would be willing to send tanks over a border? Was it that simple, that there was an appraisal of him as a person and a decision maker that didn't encompass launching a very ill-considered and possibly self-defeating ground war?
I think there were a couple things going on. And first, as a caveat, I should say that I think the U.S. intelligence community should get a huge amount of credit for sniffing out what was coming, and the Biden administration for warning everyone what was coming. If you wonder, why the United States has this massive intelligence establishment that costs tons of money, this is why, right? Because it gave us advanced warning of this major geopolitical shock. And notwithstanding what I said about people not being willing to believe it was coming, actually positioned the U.S. and other countries better than they would have been to respond. But I think
to stay on that for a sec before you go on to your next point is, it was very interesting to watch how the Biden administration handled that intel and made it public. Because remember, they were sort of leaking bits about a massing of Russian forces on Ukraine's eastern border. And people were like, is this wagging the dog? Or, are they just trying to manipulate public opinion, et cetera, et cetera? And what they were saying to people was, you should believe what we're seeing and hearing.
And they were taking away some of the options Putin otherwise would have had for manipulating the situation to make it look as though Ukraine had somehow provoked a conflict. And so a lot of what the U.S. intelligence community was doing was saying, the Russians are going to stage this sort of false flag operation. Don't believe it when it happens. So that notwithstanding, I think there were really two big things that stood in the way of more people heeding those warnings and understanding what was coming at them. The first was that I think a lot of us failed to understand how much Putin's decision-making had atrophied over his 20 plus years in power, and in particular during his 2+ years, I guess almost 2 years of COVID-induced isolation. And so the reason a lot of people didn't think Putin was going to stage a full-on invasion is because what he was doing didn't seem to make sense. It made a lot more sense to think that Putin was just going to try to nibble away at a little bit more Ukrainian territory. And the reason we didn't get that is we didn't realize, I think, how much decision-making had atrophied with Putin, but also within a regime that had become increasingly dysfunctional as the level of sycophancy around Putin increased. The second thing, though, was that I think it was just shocking to people to think that this sort of thing could happen in the modern age, right? It looked like 19th century conquest. And so I think it took the thing actually happening, right? And seeing these images of Russian tanks streaming across the border, learning what the Russians had done in Bucha and countless other places in Ukraine, to realize that this sort of behavior is still real, right? It doesn't go away. The question is just whether we can suppress it and keep it at bay.
And not to be forgotten, he rolled into Crimea in 2014. So 8
Right.
years earlier, he had already sort of done an opening act to a land grab.
Yes.
From his side of the ledger, do you think the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan and Ukraine moving more warmly toward NATO membership also encouraged him to act, or one of those, both of those, none of those? What do you think about those things?
I think Putin definitely got stuck in a trap of his own making, in the sense that his aggression in 2014, which you mentioned, and after, really left Ukraine with no choice but to move closer to the West in a way that I think would have been quite controversial in Ukrainian politics prior to the taking of Crimea in 2014. Ukraine was actually quite divided on the question of whether it wanted a Western identity, whether it wanted to move closer to NATO and the European Union, or whether it wanted a close affiliation with Russia prior to that. But, by baring his teeth in the way that he did, Putin basically left Ukraine's only option for maintaining its territorial integrity, such as it was, and perhaps even survival, as moving closer to the West. And then as that happens, Putin says, oh, Ukraine is moving closer to the West. I really don't want that. I better do something to prevent that from being consolidated. And so even though Ukraine was not on the verge of being admitted to NATO or anything like that in early 2022, I think Putin was genuinely worried by the westward drift of Ukrainian policy. He didn't realize, or at least chose not to acknowledge, that that drift was largely a result of his own actions. On the first issue we raised, which is the pullout from Afghanistan, it's really difficult to say for certain. In general, I think it's bad for U.S. policy when the U.S. fails in a major undertaking of some 20 years, when there's a chaotic rush to the exits, and so on and so forth. And so I wouldn't be shocked if at the margin, right, it was some small percentage of Putin's calculus was influenced by this view that the United States was weak, that it was in decline, that it was losing resolve to pursue its interests in an assertive way in the international system. And he might have gotten some of that impression from Afghanistan. But I think if it mattered mostly at the margin. I think the invasion was mostly about his perception of the strategic situation in and around Ukraine.
And so, regardless of causation, here we are. And what do you think are some of the most significant things that have changed? You talked a little bit earlier about the militarization of Poland, the expansion of NATO, include Finland and Sweden, things that would have been unheard of. But what do you think are some of the other sort of big tentpole changes that this has catalyzed?
I think there are three. The first is the revival and reconsolidation of what we would have called the free world back in the Cold War. And so the Ukraine war has obviously led to greater cohesion and greater effort within NATO, but it's also had that effect on the other side of Eurasia, in East Asia and in the Western Pacific, where the war has given momentum to the defense reforms that Japan and Taiwan are making. It has led to fears that aggression in Europe might be a prelude to aggression in Asia, and so it has facilitated U.S. coalition building efforts vis-a-vis China. And so what the Ukraine war has done is it's strengthened kind of the free world, the democratic alliance blocks on both sides of Eurasia, and also led them to do more together. And so it's really interesting that South Korea has quietly been one of the most indispensable members of the coalition supporting Ukraine by supplying artillery ammunition and things like that. Japan and Taiwan and Australia have joined in the sanctions coalition and helped in other ways as well, because there's an increasing recognition that what happens on one side of the Eurasian landmass can still matter for countries on the other side. So thing one would be kind of consolidation of this free world community. Thing two, unfortunately, is greater integration of what you might think of as, the axis of Eurasian autocracies. And so the war has pushed Russia closer to China, because as Russia is cut off from the West as a result of its own actions, it has few strategic alternatives other than to deepen its relationship with China. It's gotten a much deeper military relationship with Iran as well. So it's not just Russia selling Iran gear anymore. It's Iran providing Russia with drones and artillery and maybe some missiles that it's used on the battlefield. And so you're seeing overlapping, closer relationships between Eurasian autocracies that have in common their shared antipathy to a U.S.-led international order. So that would be thing two. And then thing three is you get what you might think of as non-alignment 2.0, but you get a whole bunch of countries around the world that basically say, we prefer to avoid choosing a side in this, right? And it could be Brazil, which gets tons of fertilizer and other things from Russia, and under Lula in particular, is not particularly desirous of following the United States into a geopolitical and ideological showdown with the Eurasian autocracies. You've got India, which is aligning ever more closely with the United States on China issues, but not doing anything of the sort with respect to Russia. You got countries throughout Southeast Asia and Africa and a variety of other places that have basically said, either we don't have a dog in this fight, or a pox on both your houses, because yes, the war is bad in terms of food security and international economic security, but so are the sanctions. And so in some ways, the international system we have now is coming to look a little bit more like the Cold War, where you've got these two opposing blocks that are consolidating, and then a large group of countries that are trying to sort of navigate the territory in between.
I love, Hal, that you respond in bullet points and lists and numbered things it makes life, very apprehensible and easy. And that you call it thing one and thing two, like Dr. Seuss. You're like the Dr. Seuss of foreign policy. So
That's right.
I'm glad we've arrived there. One of the other extraordinary things to me about the consequences of this war is that Germany and Japan are rearming. And that's another one of those, who would have thought, especially anyone who's interested in or a student of World War II, that, we'd be 80-ish years on, where everyone is advocating rearming Germany to deal with a more aggressive Russia and rearming Japan to deal with a more aggressive China. That also just seems extraordinary to me.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to note that Germany's rearmament is a bit more aspirational, whereas Japan's is happening in real time. And so the Germans have made a variety of commitments to get to 2% of GDP for their level of military spending, which is the standard within NATO, or at least it's supposed to be the standard within NATO. But as is often the case, there have subsequently been delays and modifications such that, the moment when we get a Germany that wields meaningful military power is still some years in the future. Japan's rearmament is remarkable by historical standards. And so at the end of 2022, the Japanese government pushed through a series of reforms that would see defense spending increase by about 70 or 80% over a 5-year period. That would see Japan acquire more offensive military capabilities like Tomahawk missiles and things of that nature, and would basically help Japan make this transformation from what it was in, say, the 1950s, when it was basically a strategic protectorate of the United States, to a real regional military power and maybe America's most important single ally in the world because of geography, because of the capabilities it has and things of that nature.
Do you think it's an overstatement, given all of these big global chess pieces that are moving around and these realignments of overseas powers in new combinations and in very clear ways now? It's not foggy. There are very purposeful alliances being formed for largely military and strategic reasons, that the risk of global war hasn't seemed so pronounced since the early 1960s? Or is that an overstatement?
No, I think the basic statement that the risk of not just war, but great power war, so war between the most powerful actors in the international system, I think that risk is higher, certainly, than at any time since the end of the Cold War, and maybe even since the hottest part of the Cold War, so the period of crisis in the late 50s and 1960s, which you referred to. I tend to think that the alliance building we're seeing and the coalition building we're seeing is more the symptom than the cause, right? And so you see countries in Europe and the transatlantic community, countries in the Indo-Pacific doing more together because they're observing either what Russia has done or what they fear China might do in the Western Pacific, and deciding they have to get together to strengthen their collective capabilities. And, it's maybe worth mentioning here that China is engaged in what U.S. officials have said is the most significant peacetime military buildup we've seen since the run-up to World War II. The military balance in the region has changed dramatically. China has become much more willing to court friction with its neighbors and the United States. We got a preview last August in the crisis that followed House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan of some of the ways in which the People's Liberation Army might use those capabilities to blockade or bombard or even invade Taiwan. And so there's just a much greater degree of anxiety among democratic states in particular in Europe and East Asia, which leads to a greater willingness to try to band together for security.
Hal, I want to take a quick break to hear from one of our sponsors, and then we'll come back and pick this conversation up. We're back, and we're joined by Hal Brands, a foreign policy savant and a very elegant thinker, and we're talking about war. Hal, before we took a break, we spent some time discussing Japan in the context of the great global Cold War that's taken shape. Let's recall that Japan is the only country to have been attacked with nuclear weapons by the U.S. during World War II. So let's talk some more about nukes. And specifically, as a departure point, I wanted to talk about the movie Oppenheimer, which I thought was a provocative, entertaining, and troubling examination of what it means to have unleashed this incredible force of energy, power, and destruction into the world. What lessons did you draw from Oppenheimer?
I think the major message that the movie tries to convey, and the major insight or takeaway that I got from it, was just the intense moral dilemmas that are created by nuclear weapons. And so nuclear weapons were created in a context where it seemed plausible that some of the worst regimes ever seen on Earth might conquer much of the Earth. And it was entirely plausible that they might develop nuclear weapons of their own. We know in retrospect the German program wasn't as advanced as we feared it was, but it was hard to know that at the time. And so I think that the moral case for building nuclear weapons in the first place was very, very strong. The challenge, though, is that nuclear weapons are kind of the most indiscriminate weapon that humanity has ever come up with. When they were used against Japan, against cities in Japan, they killed a lot of non-combatants. And as you got into not just the nuclear, but the thermonuclear age, so the development of the hydrogen bomb and a lot of the follow-on weapons in the 1950s and after, you were talking about weapons that could be civilization shattering in their effects. And so if there was a full-on nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's not clear, how much of humanity would have been left after that. And so these weapons served important strategic purposes in winning World War II and in hopefully deterring World War III vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But they were weapons whose use was so destructive that it was hard to understand what moral or political purpose that could actually serve. And I think that tormented the real Oppenheimer, as well as the Oppenheimer in the film. And I think that dilemma consumed a lot of American policymakers during the Cold War as well.
There's this one moment during the film where all of the scientists involved in researching fission and fusion and the use of a nuclear weapon are uncertain whether or not even the tests might actually ignite the entire atmosphere. And there's this just sort of troubling, moment where we just have to go for it. And yes, the atmosphere may actually get torched by our test, but there's no other way to test it. And fortunately, they didn't torch the entire atmosphere. But, I feel some of this now in the present in a different way, in that Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And he certainly won't torch the atmosphere, but he could ignite a broader war. And it's going to present this complex response if we were to go there. And, you recently wrote in a really long, wonderfully all-encompassing Bloomberg Opinion column that the true impact of nuclear stockpiles in the world we're in right now is largely psychological. And I always enjoy quoting you, but I'm just going to quote you here because it's very descriptive. And you say, nuclear weapons may be good insurance against invasion, but they aren't a foolproof guarantee that a country fighting for survival won't hit back with attacks on a nuclear-armed aggressor's soil. And so you sort of have these two forces in play. One is that the nukes themselves discourage overly aggressive confrontations, or maybe confrontations at all. And then once they occur, because, as you've already mentioned, they're so indiscriminate in their destructive force that they don't really deter conventional warfare in certain theaters. Can you just expound on this a little bit and then sort of offer our listeners a take on whether or not this is a good rule of the road to think about going forward? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways of thinking about the role that nuclear weapons have played in Ukraine. And the first way essentially holds that they haven't had much effect at all. And so since day one of the war, literally, Putin has been brandishing nuclear weapons against Ukraine, against the West, threatening to use them if certain things happen. Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And yet Putin hasn't used nuclear weapons. And the fact that he possesses so many nuclear weapons, it hasn't allowed him to win the war. It hasn't deterred Ukraine from fighting back and even bringing the war onto Russian soil. It hasn't deterred the United States and other countries from supporting Ukrainian forces as they kill tens of thousands of Russian personnel and target Russia's generals and do a lot of things that are hugely embarrassing to Putin's regime. And so one way of looking at this is you can have all the nuclear weapons you want, but it's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to prevail in a contest against a weaker non-nuclear country. And you may run into the problem that actually using nuclear weapons, deploying them in battle, provokes so much global blowback that it's not worth it. And this appears to be the lesson that Putin drew in late 2022 when he was making all sorts of nuclear threats. And the Chinese and the Indians and a bunch of other countries basically said, it would be a really bad idea for you to do this, comrade. But the second way of looking at this is that even if nuclear weapons aren't used in battle, they still profoundly shape the way that this war and other wars play out. And so Russia's nuclear weapons have had a deterrent effect on the United States. They have deterred the United States from getting directly involved in the fighting, which I think might well have happened already if we were talking about a nuclear United States and NATO confronting a Russia that did not have nuclear weapons. They have deterred the United States from providing certain capabilities to Ukraine. So the United States has been very cautious about providing Ukraine with capabilities that can allow Ukraine to reach into Russia for fear of sparking escalation. And so Russian nuclear coercion is working to an important degree, even if it hasn't achieved as much as Putin likes. But U.S. nuclear coercion is also working, right? And so if the United States didn't have an alliance like NATO that was backed by the U.S. nuclear arsenal, I think it's entirely likely that Putin would be doing much more to try to coerce or bloody the countries that are supporting Ukraine, right? It's not like Putin doesn't know where the weapons that are coming into Ukraine are coming from. They're being assembled at logistical hubs and staging points in Poland and other countries,
right,
not that far across the border, right? The Russians could go and attack these things with air power or ground-based missiles if they wanted to. They've chosen not to because they know that that would lead to a war with NATO, which is backed by the nuclear arsenal of the United States. And so both sides are actually coercing each other to a degree. And so the contours of the war have been powerfully shaped by nuclear weapons, even though they haven't actually been fired off in anger.
But as I think this through, Hal, and it's interesting because mutually assured destruction and co-equal coercion and the reality of nuclear weapons has created this kind of proxy war at this point, with Russia's being supported by other countries as well, Ukraine's being supported by the U.S. and other countries as well. And this horrible military confrontation is also this dance that has gotten everyone into a bit of a corner now. I don't know if it's a stalemate just yet, but certainly it's gotten to the point where it's not clear if Ukraine pushes Russia out of eastern Ukraine, that they'll stop at the border. It's not clear that Russia would stop the war if that happened. And then what brings this kind of a war to a conclusion, unless there's some sort of an escalation, in the absence of a diplomatic resolution, nothing will end it unless there's an escalation. And U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said that America has warned Putin of undisclosed catastrophic consequences if Russia went nuclear. But even if Russia doesn't go nuclear, the U.S. is possibly going to have to raise the stakes to force a conclusion here. So how do you think about those things?
I think you're exactly right. If the U.S. wants to not just help Ukraine liberate its territory, but, and this may be the even harder part, convince Putin to accept that, or convince Putin to accept any settlement that leaves Ukraine mostly intact territorially, viable economically, defensible militarily, and things of that nature, it's going to have to exert more coercion than it has exerted to date. And we've already seen this dynamic at work in U.S. policy. And so the U.S. has been more willing, not so much to kind of sprint across, but to stick a toe across Putin's red lines in this conflict. It's more willing to do that now than it was a year ago. And so the United States initially said it wasn't going to provide F-16s because that might be escalatory. Well, now we're providing F-16s. The United States initially said we're not going to provide ATACMS missiles, basically the longer range version of the HIMARS rockets that the Ukrainians have used to good effect. Well, now there's some reporting that the U.S. might be sending ATACMS to Ukraine after all. And I think what this reflects is a realization that the U.S. is going to have to do more to help Ukraine win this conflict, even if it requires testing some of these Russian red lines. And the U.S. has more confidence in doing this because Putin has talked a lot about using nuclear weapons, or he's hinted at it at least. Some of his subordinates have talked about it more explicitly, and Russia hasn't actually done anything so far. So that makes U.S. officials feel that the Russian red lines may not be so red after all. But there is a bigger question out there, which is that is it going to be possible for the U.S. to help Ukraine accomplish its objectives without the U.S. intervening more directly in the war? And that would be a big escalatory move on the part of the United States. It might be warranted morally and otherwise, but it would require a much more deliberate decision to test Russian red lines directly and to test the proposition of whether two nuclear-armed great powers can fight a conventional war, which is what this would entail, without nuclear escalation occurring.
And we've been focusing a lot on Russia, but of course, China itself strategizes around its own nuclear capability, having a nuclear neighbor like Russia, and jousting with the U.S. for military dominance. Biden has said at different points he wouldn't fight Russia directly in Ukraine. And I wonder if China draws a happy lesson from that as they watch how the U.S. maneuvers in Ukraine and thinks, well, if the U.S. isn't really going to confront Russia here, nothing's preventing us from, say, dipping our toe into Taiwan.
I think this is a real challenge. One of the big guessing games in DC these days is what lessons is Xi Jinping learning from the war in Ukraine? And you can tell a good news story where Xi Jinping is learning that conquest is hard. He's learning that U.S. intelligence is really good. He's learning that outrageous aggression tends to provoke a lot of blowback that you might not have expected and a variety of other bad consequences. And if that's the case, that might make him more hesitant to use force against Taiwan. He may also be drawing the lesson, however, that the United States simply won't go to war conventionally against a nuclear-armed great power, because this is exactly what Joe Biden has said in the context of the war in Ukraine. If you go back to the beginning of the war, he issued a tweet and made a variety of other statements, essentially saying what I've just said verbatim, that there's no way the United States can fight Russia in a conflict because that would lead to World War III, and we obviously all want to avoid World War III. The challenge, of course, is that China is also a nuclear-armed great power. And so if China attacks Taiwan, the United States has to choose between fighting a nuclear-armed great power and letting Taiwan be conquered. And China has been developing its own nuclear arsenal very rapidly, not just strategic nuclear capabilities, so things that can reach all the way to the United States, but so-called theater nuclear capabilities, things that are perhaps a little bit more useful in terms of actually fighting a regional war against the United States. And it's entirely plausible that if China did move against Taiwan, it would couple that with warnings to the United States saying, this is a fight over China's territorial integrity. If you get involved, we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. And that threat would be very difficult for the United States to deal with. And so one of the challenges the Biden administration, I think, has faced over the past couple of years is trying to disabuse Xi Jinping of this notion that the United States would only support Taiwan in the same way that it has supported Ukraine, by sending weapons and other things without actually getting directly involved. But if Xi Jinping thought that America's actions in Ukraine spoke louder than its words about Taiwan, he might be wrong, but he wouldn't be insane to draw that conclusion. So I worry a little bit that the declaratory statements we've made about nuclear weapons in the Ukraine context may actually be somewhat unhelpful in the Taiwan context.
So many scary things to worry about, interesting things to think about. Let's take one more break, and then we'll come back to the show. I'm back with Hal Brands, who's educated me about how the world works. Hal, we've been talking about the chill winds of our current Cold Wars, and 2024 is an election year. So talk to me about how you assess the Biden team's foreign policy conduct thus far, taking into account some of the things we've already discussed.
I think on the whole, the Biden team has done a pretty good job on foreign policy. I think there were definitely some hiccups or stumbles early on. The Afghanistan war ended in a way that nobody can think particularly good things about. There were a variety of other challenges. There are a variety of challenges that are still out there. I'm not sure that the administration has much of a viable Middle East strategy at this point, for instance. But on the two biggest issues, which are the Ukraine war and the competition with China, I would certainly give the administration passing marks, and I think they've done pretty well. So I think the administration has done pretty well in imposing a huge cost on Ukraine and using that war as an opportunity, tragic as it is, to rally the larger free world community. There are times I wish the administration had done a little bit more, a little bit faster to support Ukraine, but most of my critiques would be kind of quibbles at the margin. With respect to China, I think the United States as a country needs to go faster to develop the sort of capabilities and coalitions that would ensure stability in the Western Pacific. But the Biden administration, to give it some credit, has done remarkable things in terms of strengthening and expanding U.S. coalitions in that part of the world. Again, there are things I would critique. This administration, like the last one, is a bit of a disaster when it comes to the economic elements of U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific, namely the absence of a meaningful trade policy. But as I mentioned, that's a bipartisan failing. And so it's hard to get particularly mad at the Biden administration as opposed to the sort of broader U.S. political class for that particular shortcoming. And so I think foreign policy is an area where the administration hasn't done everything right, but they have a decent record to run on in 2024.
It's also been a long time since any administration of any political stripe has had to really think in a real-time way about multi-theater engagements with very robust opponents.
Yeah, that's right. And this is an area where I think it is probably fair to give the administration a little bit of criticism in the first year. One of the things the administration argued in the first year was that it basically just needed to park the confrontations with Russia and Iran so it could focus on China. I think that rhetoric was probably a little bit unhelpful in the impact that it had on Vladimir Putin, because it may have helped convince him that if he pushed hard in Ukraine, the U.S. would be distracted and unwilling to respond as strongly as it actually did. But I think the administration has started to get a better handle on that strategically over the last couple of years. It does raise a larger question, though, which is that, the U.S. has been moving toward a military strategy over the past 10 years or so that's essentially premised on the idea that the United States would not need to fight more than one significant war at once. That shift was necessary in a way to help the Pentagon focus on the demands of competition and potentially conflict with China, as opposed to getting pulled in a lot of different directions. But if you just look at the way the world is going today, it's unfortunately not that hard to imagine scenarios in which the U.S. might face violent instability in Eastern Europe and East Asia, or East Asia and the Persian Gulf at the same time.
If polls are to be believed, Donald Trump is highly likely to be the Republican nominee for president. If he winds up in the White House again, how do you think about the second Trump administration's foreign policy as it enters this very perilous world we're living in right now?
I think it would be really dangerous and really bad, just to be perfectly honest with you. I think that Donald Trump brings a unique combination of incompetence, illiberalism, and unilateralism to U.S. domestic policy and U.S. foreign policy. And that would be a pretty destabilizing element on the international stage right now. Yes, Trump would do some things that, a card-carrying China hawk like me would appreciate. He would be economically fairly tough with the Chinese. But, Trump has shown very little understanding of why, for instance, Taiwan matters strategically. He would also pursue
where it is on a map, perhaps, even.
Like where it is on a map, the role it plays in the first island chain. I think he would probably pursue a policy of omnidirectional antagonism. So he would annoy the Chinese while also picking fights with U.S. allies in the Asia Pacific. And certainly it would be bad news from Ukraine's perspective, because Trump, as was the case during his first term, continues to kind of, read the lines that the Russians might have written for him on the Ukraine war and how the United States needs to extricate itself from that fight. Whether he would actually do that or not is a different question. But certainly the prospect that Trump might become president is one of the things that Putin is looking to as a means of salvation in the Ukraine war. He can hold out hope that Trump will be elected and the U.S. will drop out of the Ukraine coalition. I think it'd be more complicated than that. But what I think isn't important, what Putin thinks is important. So I think the reality is that countries around the world, in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, are already trying to figure out what a second Trump presidency would mean for them. They're trying to hedge their bets now so that they are not caught out if Trump is reelected. And if Trump is reelected, it would make it far harder to make the argument that the Biden administration has tried to make, that yes, there was this period when Trump was president and it was very disruptive. But that's not the real American foreign policy. The real American foreign policy is what we're seeing now. If Trump gets a second term, I think it's much harder to make that argument. And so you just inject a much higher degree of uncertainty about the long-term future of U.S. foreign policy as well.
And every other global player has to consider an unpredictable but powerful U.S. with unclear strategic goals and a very itchy but unstable trigger finger in the Oval Office. If you could wave your magic diplomatic wand across the globe, looking at, essentially at what's going on in Eastern Europe right now and what's going on in East Asia in terms of militarization and this lurking Cold War, How would you like to see it resolved?
Well, ideally, you would see Russia and China become, willing, constructive members of the US-led international order. And I don't say that simply because I'm an American and I like a US-led international order for that reason, although I'm sure that's true to a degree, but because the international order that the US and its friends have built since 1945 has helped deliver the most peaceful, prosperous, humane world we've ever lived in. If you had to pick a 75-year period in history in which to live, you'd pick this one for that reason. And I think it would serve a lot of people's interests around the world if this international system were to continue and it were to thrive. And moreover, the fact is that the world is healthier if it has a China and Russia playing a constructive role in the international system, because these countries make up a huge chunk of humanity. They make up a huge chunk of the Earth's surface. And it's kind of hard to imagine a stable international system if Russia and China are permanently excluded from it. So that would be my wish. The reality, unfortunately, is that I just don't see any prospect of this happening anytime soon. It's certainly not going to happen on Putin's watch in Moscow. And I worry that it's not going to happen on Xi's watch or perhaps even after that in China. And so I think realistically, the objective of the United States has to be to strengthen the international order around Russia and China to limit their ability to do it harm, whether through violent aggression or economic predation, and try to build as strong as possible a community of like-minded states that are committed to the international order because they recognize the benefits that it holds for them. Unfortunately, that's also a recipe for a fairly long, protracted, difficult, dangerous standoff with Moscow, Beijing, and some of their confederates around the world. But I think that's the best we're likely to get in the coming years.
I always like to ask folks at the end of the show what they've learned. As you look at the events of the last year and a half in a very tight time frame, what do you know now that you didn't know then?
That's a great question. I think that the period since February 2022 has underscored a bunch of things for me. I think one thing would be the events of the last 18, 19 months are a reminder of how fragile international order is. We take for granted that we live in this world where global trade is possible, where great power war is rare, where democracy is widespread. But that order is really just the product of the efforts of the states that are sustaining it. And what the Ukraine war indicates is that there are actors out there with dramatically different preferences for how the world should work, right? Vladimir Putin does not want to live in a liberal international order. He does not want to live in a world where territorial sovereignty is considered sacrosanct. He does not want to live in a world where human rights are widely respected and democracy is the dominant form of government. And so the war reveals the way in which the world would change if these sorts of actors got the upper hand. And so that's perhaps the first lesson. The second lesson, though, I think, is how much gas there still is in the tank when it comes to American leadership. And, we had heard a lot of talk after the Trump era or after the global financial crisis before this about how we're moving out of an era of American power or moving into a multipolar world, how the world has changed fundamentally. But when Russia attacks Ukraine, the fundamental rally point in Europe was NATO, which is a US-led alliance. You see off-the-chart demand for more American engagement in that region and elsewhere. You see how countries are clustering around the United States. And so one of the fundamental enablers of American influence in the international system is the fact that the United States supports a concept of international order that is attractive or at least acceptable to lots of other powerful states in the world, particularly advanced democracies. And so when a crisis like this happens, they try to do more with the United States rather than less, and that has the effect of further shoring up this order that's under threat. And so you can look at this in a couple of different ways. The war underscored for me the fragility of international order, but also in some way the resilience of it.
Hal, I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but we have run out of time in our little visit, so I'm going to have to call it quits. But thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Hal Brands is a foreign policy professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he's a Bloomberg Opinion columnist. Here at Crash Course, we believe that collisions can be messy, impressive, challenging, surprising, and always instructive. In today's Crash Course, I learned that no matter how much I might be wishing for a peaceful resolution to all of the complex and dangerous conflicts that are brewing in the world right now, the need to end them might involve something other than just diplomacy. What did you learn? We'd love to hear from you. You can tweet at the Bloomberg Opinion handle @opinion or me @Tim O'Brien using the hashtag Bloomberg Crash Course. You can also subscribe to our show wherever you're listening right now, and please leave us a review. It helps other people find the show. This episode was produced by the indispensable Anna Mazarakis, Moses Andam, and me. Our supervising producer is Magnus Henriksen, and we had editing help from Sage Bauman, Katie Boyce, Jeff Grocott, Mike Nitza, and Christine Vanden Beilard. Blake Maples does our sound engineering, and our original theme song was composed by Luis Guerra. I'm Tim O'Brien. We'll be back next week with another Crash Course.